Good morning and welcome to our webinar today on the topic of managing risk amongst a rapidly growing third-party ecosystem, a problem that many of us are facing. And I'm delighted to welcome two guests to our webinar today. Lane Sullivan from Magellan Health and Tim Cleary from Bridgewater Associates. Welcome to you both. Lane is the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Magellan Health, a Centene company. He has more than 25 years experience in IT and security with multiple certifications, including all the usual ones. I won't bore you with the long list. Lane has also hands-on experience with firewalls, penetration testing, application development, server and infrastructure, email, service desk, production control, GRC, and more. He has literally done it all. Welcome to you, Lane. And alongside Lane, we have today Tim. Tim Cleary is the head of Security Risk and Counsel at Bridgewater Associates, where he's responsible for the firm's security policy, governance, and risk team, and advises senior management on a range of cybersecurity, privacy, and related matters. Before joining Bridgewater, he worked in management consulting and was a capital markets attorney, which has set him up beautifully for his current role. Tim, welcome to you also. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and welcome to all of you watching our webcast. So we're going to start right out of the gate by talking a little bit about current context and situation for each of you. I wonder, Tim, if I could start with you. Would you give us an idea of the size of your cybersecurity team and how many third parties are in your ecosystem? Yep. Just to give us a feel for the scale of your operations.
For sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be part of this. To give just the basic context, is I'd say we take security very seriously here. When you think about our business, it's managing risk in the investment side, and that extends to the operational side of things. And given that we have about 60 or so full-time security professionals here internally at Bridgewater, that's on top of any external experts that we bring in from time to time. And then you asked about the overall third-party count, Peter. I'd say for risk management purposes, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 third parties. And we draw that line fairly broadly. There are, of course, a lot of them, vendors that we pay money to for services. But when we think about the goal of what we're trying to do, it makes sense to include all of the various strategic partners, other folks where when we think about what are the risks to Bridgewater from third parties, we go beyond just the vendors list and think about all of the relevant entities.
Absolutely. And that's one good reason to talk about third parties rather than vendors, isn't it? Because of that broader ecosystem definition. And Lane, I'm wondering from your side at Magellan Health, give us a sense of size of team, size of ecosystem that you're managing with your third parties today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for having me too. This is a fantastic conversation. For Magellan, again, we're in the healthcare industry, so we're regulated. We've got a lot of contractual obligations. For my team, we sit just at about 80 for FTEs. Contractors, we push about 100 with everybody all inclusive. We talk about how many vendors, how many third party, definitely north of the 1,000 range. We've got thousands of vendors that we deal with. And it depends on how much we interact with those vendors, depending on the risk of the organization. The person that mows the yard is a little bit different than the people that manage our PHI.
Totally fair. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you both for setting that context for us. And I think many of our listeners are going to be recognizing that whether it's 8 or whether it's 60, there's still not enough to do the work that needs to be done. So we're going to get into a little bit about how do we allocate resources appropriately? How do we prioritize across the piece? But one of the most important considerations when thinking about third-party risk management, of course, is the context that the business is operating within and the nature of the legal or statutory requirements that affect those businesses. So I think it would be quite helpful for our listeners today to understand a little bit more about that regulatory environment, because we're going to come on and talk about compliance-driven versus risk-driven risk management. So Lane, would you mind just giving us your sort of high-level view of what type of compliance requirements are you operating within, particularly within the healthcare sector, of course, some very specialized requirements for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with every organization when they do business has contractual obligations. And so we can talk about the different regulations we have, complexity and things like that. But be mindful that every organization has their own contractual requirements, whether it's regulated by the government or not. And so a lot of things that we can talk about broadly are process and things that would be implemented whether you have an 8-person security team or a 100-person security team. Right. And so for Magellan, we have contractual obligations, regulatory. We have our customers would be the state agencies and federal government. So we do have certain control frameworks that we have to abide by. NIST 853 moderate, the CMMC, the 800-171, MARS-E, and we have a lot of state agencies that build their own little modified versions of certain frameworks, like 853 high plus or moderate plus, and there's just certain states that have their own that are just a little unique. So for us, we do work with a lot of different control frameworks. If you do, the recommendation from my side would be rationalize all of those contractual and those requirements from the feds, build them into an enterprise control framework so you have one solid list that ties back to those so that you're covering all the requirements in one list that you build back into your policies.
Great advice, Lane. Yes, appreciate that. And from your point of view, Tim, not operating in exactly the same space, obviously, as Magellan Health, how does it look from your point of view?
Well, I was going to say, between health and investment management, we could spend the balance of the half hour perhaps on this question, but we won't. I'll say a lot of what Lane said is true for us as well, right? Bridgewater's investment manager, accordingly, we're subject to regulation from federal domestic agencies, from state agencies, from international regulatory bodies. I won't go through all of them, but it's a similar situation to what he described. And I think the advice is very well placed in terms of having some single source of truth that tells you where you are across all of them so that you're not having to, maintain a patchwork of individual frameworks and so forth to deal with it. And I think that's about all I'd say here. I know we're going to get a little bit more into it later in terms of how we incorporate that into risk management generally.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, thanks, Tim. Well, let's take that forwards here. So just to start us off today, get the ball rolling. In a previous webcast, we actually did an audience poll which showed that 67% of listeners were challenged by staff resources and capacity when implementing a TPRM program. That probably comes as not a great surprise, but with so many third parties, both of you talking in the number of thousands, where do you start? What are some of the first steps that you should be taking in your program? And what does TPRM actually mean in that context? So maybe just to get us going, Tim, perhaps you could just set it out kind of top down, working through to how do you approach that big challenge of matching resources to prioritizing your risks?
For sure. So there's an obvious, almost security 101 version of the answer, which also has the benefit of being useful and true, which I'll just say that, namely, you start with the assets or the processes that are most important to you. And then based upon that, focus your assets accordingly. I realize that may not be the most insightful thing at that level, but it honestly does get you a lot of the way there. And if you think that you're going to apply the same level of scrutiny or oversight to all of the vendors or all the risks or what have you, you're wrong, you're fooling yourself. And so like that very obvious thing can often be somewhat useful. At a more practical level, the advice I'd give and what we do here is invest the time to actually be systematic in terms of how you work through and prioritize your vendors. Like take the time to write down what it is that matters. And it could be simple. It could be as simple as like, what's the kind of data they have? What's the sort of connectivity do they have? What processes do they manage and so on? But then actually stick to it. Because what you'll find is if you don't, your vendor registry or whatever your source of truth is going to be filled with years of, well, we handled Acme Co this way because of such and such thing that was happening. And you don't want that. You want to have something that's actually understandable to your other stakeholders in the business, to people who may do this job after you, and like, most importantly, you want to be able to interrogate your logic and what it is that you did so that a year or two from now, when you're wondering, why the heck did I agree to such and such arrangement with Acme Co., you actually have some logic you can point to for why. That's something we do in a lot of areas here at Bridgewater. I found it very helpful in bringing order to some of the chaos that can result when you're juggling 1,000 different vendors and trying to be thoughtful about it.
Love that. And I mean, obviously, when facing scale of any kind, some form of standardization and repeatability makes the job more doable. So I love the way that you approach that, Tim. Lane, how does it look from your point of view? How do you think about that universe of third parties that you're managing to get to the ones that matter and how you prioritize your risks?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the size of the organization and what they can invest in people, process, technologies for that. I would say, yes, Tim, spot on. I would say for the small organizations, and if you don't have a very strong TPRM, which I'd like to rethink, and I'd like everyone to rethink how we use the TPRM anymore, because it's more than just providing a risk assessment of a vendor, specifically on the security side. Building a vendor security assurance program where you're creating assurances around the risk is not just a GRC function. It's not a security function. It is a team of privacy and security architects. And if you have BISOs, contract review, IT infrastructure, vendor management, the SOC, if you have an incident with the vendors, it all has to be a team effort for a program, a security assurance program. I would say that, like everything else, when you talk about the basics, like Tim was talking about, identity and asset management, third-party management, know what it is. So start with what is the universe, and then start breaking that down into what is the risk to the organization, what kind of data are they processing, but start tying in the basics of what is it that is the requirement for that vendor. If it's a contract that is stipulating the need for certain requirements, are you pushing the same requirements to those vendors to know that you're adhering to whatever you're agreed to from your organization's perspective to the vendor?
Right. Yeah, that all the way through. And that brings up the issue of remediation versus mitigation. How do you think about that in the context of the vendor community that you work with, Lane, today? What are the criteria that you use to determine whether you're the one that needs to be taking the action to protect your own assets versus requiring action from your third party so to do?
From our perspective, when we have a contractual requirement, we are the custodians of the data at first before it moves over to a third party. And so we have a contractual obligation with whoever it is, a client, a customer, right? We have to force those down to the vendors. So we have to create the same expectation that we would have to apply the controls that they would have to as well. Can we provide some mitigating controls in some instances? Yes. But ultimately, when you enter into a relationship with a vendor where it's supporting customer contracts, they are an extension of you, and either it's them or you, doesn't matter.
Right. So essentially back to back is the way to approach that, if I'm understanding you correctly. Tim, do you see it any differently? Do you think about that, line that gets drawn between, mitigation versus remediation, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of your vendors who are maybe non-compliant in specific areas or where you have awareness of control gaps? What approach do you typically take in that sense?
Well, I think it's going to vary. First of all, I agree just with the general framework that Lane set out. And so I'll just add a couple thoughts to layer on top of it is, first of all, there's just the reality of what you're referring to, Peter, is that sometimes it just may be, I'd really love to have such and such arrangement in place, and I'm not going to get it because of just the respective bargaining power or whatever it is.
Right.
And so as long as you're holding the goal correctly, right, of like, what is it that I actually need and what are the different ways to get there, that's going to most cases dictate which course we're on. So that's the one practical point I would layer on here. And that actually leads to one other thought I was going to mention in response to your prior question, which this relates to, even more resource constrained folks, to that point of being realistic about it. Recognize that you're just not going to be able to do everything you want. And that applies with some of the mitigation and so on that you're asking about in this question, Peter. It also applies to the general approach. You're going to have to get comfortable with saying, I can't have that. Anytime that you're dealing with 1,000 vendors or 500 vendors or whatnot. And so just be targeted on where you're applying the headspace, the angst to negotiate, or the work to put in place compensating controls that it ties to what actually matters.
Right. Great advice. Well, it's time for our first audience poll. So I'm going to invite a pollster to put up our question for us today. We're going to start with this question. Is your organization more risk or compliance focused? Please make a choice. If you balance them equally across the two, then please indicate accordingly. So while our listeners are having a chance to respond to that, maybe we should just test the validity of the question in itself. Tim, does it even make sense for us to think about a trade-off between risk management versus compliance? Is there a line between the two? How do you think about that?
No, I'm sure there's a very frameworky type debate to be had about it, because of course compliance risk is just another type of risk. But if I take the nature of the question as what is the business risk? Is that the primary driver, or is it compliance with some sort of external standard or client agreement or what have you? Here at Bridgewater, it very much is the former, right? We're starting with how does our business work? What are the relevant risks to that? And being very thoughtful in terms of everything I said about resource application on down. And then, of course, I'll state the obvious here, we take compliance extremely seriously here. What we found, though, at least I'll speak to the security space, is a lot of the time what the regulators are asking for take the form of largely very good, sensible hygiene for industry registrants such as ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we find if we're managing risk well and being focused on that in an important way, we're usually a lot of the way there, if not more than the way there, on what the underlying regulations are. And it's also just neater. The last thing I'll say here is that is just sort of how it should work, right? It is we're here running the business we are. And of course, there are things that we need to do, but they're not going to drive the analysis, right? What's going to drive it is what do we need? And then we're going to layer on the things, what externally might we have to do? Again, the good news is most of the time in our experience in the investment management space, however, there's enough alignment between the two that we don't have to do too much separate.
So would necessary but not sufficient be a good way to respond to that thought on the compliance side?
I don't know if I would try to characterize the approach of our regulators quite like that, but I would say, again, it's things we take very seriously.
Lane, looking at these poll results, so here we are, our results are in. We've got about a half of our audience who try to manage both equally and in leaning among the balance towards risk over compliance. Lane, what are your reactions to seeing that data? Any surprises there for you?
It doesn't really surprise me. I would say that the people that sit in the compliance camp are probably the ones that are feeling the most pain. Because the knee-jerk reaction would be, it's only this piece we need to be compliant to. And if you take that approach, you miss the universe. And so when I think of the question, I would word a little bit differently than what Tim did, which is it risk-based, is it compliance-based, or is it governance-based? Because if you understand the need to that needs to be delivered by the organization, you don't really know whether it's compliant or not. And you don't know whether it's risk-based or not, because you don't know the full risk unless you understand what needs to be delivered. So I would say it doesn't really surprise me. If we look at the way that we manage our reaction to that, I would say that probably focusing on the governance piece would be the best thing for most organizations. Understanding what the risk is for not delivering and understanding the compliance obligations. And there's teams, there should be separate teams that for segregation of duty issues that should be following those processes, right? But if we try to change the mindset of the organization to focus on the governance side, we actually will feed more into the need for the compliance and the risk teams, and it will garner more physical assets, your people that need to drive those.
I think you're highlighting there why perhaps so many of our respondents highlighted the need to consider both, because it's bringing them both together in an appropriate way to serve the business. That seems to be the priority that you're both expressing, if I'm understanding it correctly. So this is a moment for us to take a quick sidebar into recent developments. Significantly, two large banks failed over the last several days, which will date stamp this particular webcast for us all, I'm sure. So what are the implications of that? These are Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank were both primarily serving tech-centric companies and startups, some in the healthcare sector as well. And now with reduced access to capital and the potential for cybersecurity to fall by the wayside in an effort to keep the lights on, what are you looking for? How is this incident changing how you view the risks? Before I get you to answer that, I'm going to ask our pollster to put up our second poll of the day. The question we'd love you to answer while you're listening to Tim and Lane discuss this topic is, will the recent bank closures cause you to assess more vendors than usual? So while our audience is responding to that, Tim and Lane, how are you responding to this situation? Has it had any material bearing on the way that you think about third-party risk management, or do you anticipate any long tail implications? Tim, how are you how are you thinking about, since you're in the financial services sector?
Yeah.
Is it having any bearing on the way that you think about third-party risk management at the moment?
Yeah, so I think I'd share a few things. First, to state the obvious, I'm not commenting with respect to any of the economic factors. We have people far more capable than I here at Bridgewater to think about that. I'd say with respect to third party, there's a few things. I think with respect to this sort of incident, on one level, it's effectively sort of a resiliency type event. You could imagine there are vendors who rely on either of those entities for their banking services, and all of a sudden, if they're paying attention to having to do that, instead of having to secure my environment or do whatever it is they need to do, that's a real factor. And in that way, it might even be similar to, like, I don't know, one of them being taken down by a ransomware event or some other sort of cyber or BCM related incident. So that definitely is relevant. The second, though, is inevitably in these times, bad actors will take opportunity and take advantage of the confusion and so on. And so more entities might be compromised. And so you have to think about that. That's definitely a component. More broadly, though, if I step back, the question raises the specter of what sort of diligence do you do on a company? Because it's not just them checking that they do, single sign-on or they have a secure environment and so on. We're trying to look at them holistically, right? And so, yeah, as part of my financial diligence, I'm not checking where they get their banking or something. But no, I am trying to look at them holistically, and that is going to cover things like financial health, how long they've been around, like so on and so forth. And so if I translate that to something practical here from your question, I think this sort of incident reinforces the need to do that, to go beyond just the typical cybersecurity diligence or whatever narrow vector you might be thinking about.
Great point. Yeah, multiple domains of risk, of which cyber is but one. Lane, do you think any differently about that? How are you responding to the events of recent days? Does it have a bearing on the way you think about third-party risk for your business?
I think it goes back to the need for us to rethink about third-party risk and that coined term and moving back more towards what I was saying with the vendor security assurance program, because there's a lot that feeds into that. And that team is more of a committee, and part of that's the financial side, part of it's privacy, and then you have your GRC and stuff. But when we look at like those vendors, any organization could implement certain controls depending on the size and the impact of what their vendors have. Tim laid out some of those risks, right? And if you're a smaller organization, you're going to want to really understand very quickly what is the impact to the security posture of your team, right, based on what happened with those banks. And it could be very easy to reach out and say, are you impacted, and will my services be impacted? And then do we need to implement mitigating controls? The second piece is on the financial side, which is not really the security side, but that security assurance program on the vendor side is, can we pay the vendors that we have that are impacted by that bank so that they can continue to do those services? And should we be proactive or should we not be proactive in that stance? Because if you send money to that bank and it's held up and it's locked and they don't get it, they're going to probably come and say, can you resend it somewhere else? And then the last thing Tim touched on, very specific targeting, very easy for awareness to do, and any organization, any size should be doing this, which is sending out notifications, however mechanism you do, whether it's email or not, to notify everybody that this is when threat actors come in and they send spoofed emails and they say, change my routing number so that it's not anymore over here, it's going to the bad guy. Make sure that there's financial controls in place and that you highlight those processes so that you're not impacted from the incident that is 2 steps out.
Yeah.
Great points all, I think, Lane. Sorry, Tim, do you want to add?
I was just saying, there's one important thing that Lane said that I think there's mentioning. It's like the idea of reaching out and so on. Look, a lot of times we talk in terms of diligence and platforms and so on and so forth. For your most important vendors, though, like your relationship is really going to be one of your strongest controls a lot of the times. And so not having it be that just when there's an issue or time of crisis and so on that you're reaching out to them, but you're actually cultivating that and building up more of a partnership in those cases where appropriate is like really one of the strongest things you can do to help buy down risk.
Great point, Tim. And of course, when we're dealing with very large portfolios and emerging threats, this could be characterized as a certain type of threat, perhaps not what we are normally dealing with. And being able to identify which of those vendors is effective is generally job one, to be able to respond appropriately. That leads me to think about this issue of visibility. I think what we can all recognize is with limited resources, we're in almost always focusing on a subset of our third-party community, where we have the greatest concerns, where we see potential control gaps that need to be addressed, and so forth and so on. I'm wondering how you both think about this idea of managing portfolio visibility across your entire landscape, so that you can make intelligent decisions on an ongoing basis, because we recognize that different threats emerging will have different impacts on that infrastructure. How are you developing your own view of your full portfolio to be able to intelligently apply those resources? Lane, what approach are you taking right now to help you improve that visibility across the landscape?
So for us, we look at holistically, like I said, based on committees. So the Vendor Security Assurance Program has many facets to it. Creating that holistic view for each team, the risk and the process for each team to own. Probably some of the biggest headways that we can make in the vendor risk space isn't just when you sign the contract, but it's managing that portfolio to understand what new risks have developed. So if on the cyber risk side, if somebody has a ransomware incident, are you detecting it quick enough to react to it? Do you have processes in place for IR on your SOC team? On the financial side, if somebody the executives are offloading stock at a high rate very quickly, is that a financial side that you're tracking? Things like that. But that all has to do with the maturity and the size of the organization, what they can assign resources to and overhead to. For us, I would say it goes back to creating a program and not an individualism, where TPRM used to be owned by the risk section or your GRC team, or shared responsibility with your GRC team. It isn't a GRC issue anymore. We need to look past that. And for us, we're also moving more away from the typical coin GRC and going to GPRC. So the governance, privacy, risk, and compliance. Because really, when we talk about data privacy, it should be a fundamental aspect of your governance program. And so tracking that is massive success for your TPRM.
Good point. Tim, what about you? As you think about that landscape of 1,000 third parties, how are you building out improved visibility across that?
No, I think Lane really covered it well. And I would only add a couple other small points, which is it is obviously a data problem, right? Keeping everything very current. And back to an earlier point, I said, like, if you think you're going to have all of the information current all of the time, you're either probably over investing or fooling yourself. And so focus on the use cases that you're going to use it for, right? Is it something where you're using it to decide where, strategic planning, where am I going to target risk or so on? Are you using it? Here's another one that's come up. To understand the blast radius of a given incident or something that's going on externally. That one actually is very useful and a very good reason to keep track of things. But don't try and boil the ocean. It's the only other thing I'd add to what Lane said. Is it's a lot of work to keep all of that stuff current. And so make sure it's tied to something you're actually using it for.
Great points. And maybe partner with someone who has a significant amount of data that is useful to you for that purpose. Well, we've come towards the end of our time together this morning, and I'd love to just ask each of you to give us one takeaway, one thing that you'd like our audience to take away from this conversation today. Lane, let me start with you.
I would say probably the biggest takeaway is if you can focus on what it is your business is driving towards and build that into the requirements. So understanding your contractual requirements for how do you deliver to your business, build that into your recommendations and your program. It will probably benefit in increasing headcount in order to deliver those. If you can create visibility into what it actually takes and what it should take and what the gaps are, it really comes down to what does your business do? And are you staffed appropriately and have the right processes and controls to identify the type of data? Is it PHI? And do you have the right staff in order to manage those contractual obligations? Highlighting that is probably key for your whole program.
That's awesome. Thank you, Lane. Tim, what about you?
No, it's funny. We didn't coordinate on this, but it perhaps just underscores how good the advice is that Lane just gives. If there's one thing I'd say is really make security generally, for that matter, but third-party security a shared mission with the business, right? The reality is we don't do security for security's sake, right? We're securing and enabling the business. That's the mission of our team. And so if you are making it so that security is a thing off to the side and it's one box among many to check with respect to what the business needs to do, that's not good, Rather, if you make it so that the business is in it with you alongside, right, that they're sharing that burden, and you're really adopting that mindset of what do I need to do to secure and enable things, that's going to be a path to success. And so whether it's specific to third-party risk or security programs generally, that's the one piece of advice I would offer.
That's awesome, Tim. It is all about the relationships at the end of the day, internal and external. That's what we're all here to support and enable. I want to thank Tim Cleary, Lane Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webcast. And for our listeners today, thank you for your time. And if you'd like to learn more about how CyberGRX can help you, please come to cybergrx.com. We specialize in supporting our 13,000 members manage cyber risk more intelligently across that third-party community. So with that, thank you. We look forward to you joining us again on a future webcast. Thank you to our special guest today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.